I know we're all missing Pastor Denny Race and the Believe Quartet this week, but they're off on a well-deserved vacation. So in the meantime, we are so glad you are with us again as we take another deep dive into some fascinating material.
Yeah, it is inspiring to see so many listeners dedicated to exploring these important topics with us.
Absolutely. And today we are taking a close look at Sabbath School Lesson #2, which explores a concept that, might seem simple at first glance, God's love.
Mm-hmm.
But as we dig deeper, we discover a depth and richness to this idea that's often called covenantal love.
Yeah.
But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe and share this channel with anyone you think might enjoy it.
Absolutely. The more we share these ideas, the richer our understanding becomes.
So one of the things that really struck me as I was reading through the lesson was this seeming paradox about God's love. It's described as completely unconditional, freely given to everyone. But at the same time, the lesson talks about conditions for truly experiencing the fullness of that love. It's almost like saying the sun is always shining, but we can choose to live in darkness by shutting our blinds.
Right.
So how do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory ideas?
That's a great way to put it. I think the lesson highlights the distinction between God's love itself, which is indeed constant and unchanging, and our relationship with Him, which requires our active participation.
Okay.
Think of it like the love between a parent and a child.
Yeah.
A parent's love for their child is always there, regardless of the child's actions. But the quality of their relationship, the closeness and connection they share, depends on the choices and actions of both the parent and the child.
That makes a lot of sense. The lesson also introduces this Hebrew word hesed to describe this unwavering aspect of God's love.
Right.
So what does this word really mean, and why is it so important for understanding this concept of covenantal love?
Hesed is one of those words that's really difficult to translate directly into English, but it goes beyond just a feeling of love. It encompasses God's enduring, steadfast, reliable, loving kindness. It's a love that's active, a love that takes initiative, a love that keeps its promises. It's not just that God loves us, it's that He is committed to us, bound to us in a covenant of love that He will never break.
That's a powerful concept. This idea of a love that's reliable,
Yeah.
that we can truly depend on no matter what. But the lesson also points out that there are times when even the most faithful individuals seem to question God's love, especially when they're going through difficult times.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's just human nature to question things when we're in pain or struggling to understand, why certain things happen.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that God's perspective is much broader than our own. He sees the bigger picture, the long-term plan, the ultimate good that He's working towards.
Okay.
And sometimes those plans involve allowing us to go through trials and challenges that we might not understand in the moment.
So it's not that God isn't loving us during those difficult times. It's that His love might be expressed in ways that we don't immediately recognize or appreciate.
Exactly. And sometimes the most profound expressions of God's love come through the challenges that force us to grow, to learn, and to rely on Him more fully.
This idea of God's unwavering love, His hesed, is beautifully illustrated in the story of King Manasseh in 2 Chronicles 33. Now, this is a king who did just about everything imaginable to turn away from God.
He did.
He set up idols, practiced sorcery, even sacrificed his own children.
It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a more dramatic rebellion against God's love and authority. Yet what happens when Manasseh finally repents?
Even after all of that, when Manasseh finally humbled himself and turned back to God, the scriptures tell us that God heard his prayer and restored him to his kingdom.
Wow.
This story is a powerful testament to the fact that no one, no matter how far they've strayed or how deeply they've sinned, is beyond the reach of God's hesed, His unfailing love and grace.
It's a reminder that we should never give up on ourselves or on others, no matter how dark things might seem. There's always the possibility of redemption, of restoration, of experiencing the fullness of God's love and forgiveness. But the lesson doesn't shy away from acknowledging that there are also times when individuals seem to reject God's love outright. So how do we understand that in light of this concept of God's unconditional love?
That's a really complex question, and while God's love is always available, always reaching out to us, we have the freedom to choose how we respond to that love.
Okay.
We can open our hearts to it, embrace it, and allow it to transform us, or we can choose to reject it, to turn away from it, to live as if it doesn't exist.
Right.
But ultimately, it's our choices that determine the depth of our relationship with God and the extent to which we experience the fullness of His love.
This brings us to another intriguing aspect of the lesson. The discussion about the different Greek words for love, specifically agape and filio.
Right.
I've often heard it said that agape represents this divine, selfless kind of love, while filio is a more human, conditional love. Is that an accurate understanding of these terms?
It's a common distinction, but I think the lesson challenges that oversimplification.
Okay.
If we look closely at the biblical text, we see that both agape and filio are used to describe God's love for us and our love for God.
Okay.
For example, in John 16:27, Jesus tells his disciples, "The Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came forth from God."
Mm-hmm.
The word used here for loves is filio.
So this suggests that filio isn't inherently inferior to agape, as is often suggested.
Exactly. And in fact, if we turn to John 14:21-23, we find Jesus saying, "He who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him."
Right.
Here, the verb used for loves is agape. This reciprocal love, this mutual indwelling, is described using a word that's often attributed solely to God.
It seems then that the quality of love isn't determined solely by the Greek word used, but rather by the character and actions of the one expressing it. The source of the love matters more than the linguistic label we attach to it.
Precisely, the lesson emphasizes that God's love is the greatest and most perfect love, not because of some special Greek word, but because it originates from God himself.
Okay.
He is the source of all love, and his love is defined by his character, his heseds, not by human language.
This discussion about the nature of God's love and our relationship with him has really challenged my thinking. It's clear that this isn't a one-sided or passive kind of love. God is actively seeking a genuine back-and-forth connection with us.
That's a crucial takeaway. God's love isn't just a feeling or an abstract concept.
Right.
It's a dynamic relational reality that invites us into a deep and meaningful connection with him. He desires our love in return, and he's deeply affected by our choices and actions.
Yeah.
He longs for us him to choose his love and to allow that love to shape our lives.
That's a beautiful thought, and it makes me think about that passage in Deuteronomy 7 where God describes his people as a special treasure and promises to keep his covenant with those who love him and keep his commandments. So this speaks to the reciprocal nature of this relationship, doesn't it?
Absolutely. God's love is steadfast and freely given, reaching out to us first. But our response to that love, our choice to love him back and to demonstrate that love through obedience, allows the relationship to deepen and flourish. It's in that back and forth dynamic, that mutual exchange of love, that the true beauty of covenantal love is revealed.
This deep dive is already giving us so much to ponder, and we haven't even touched on the parable of the unforgiving servant and the call to reflect God's love to others. So what stands out to you most about this exploration of covenantal love so far?
For me, it's the realization that God's love isn't just this abstract force out there somewhere. It's a personal, relational reality that we can experience, that we can participate in, that we can allow to shape our lives in profound ways.
I completely agree, and it's incredibly reassuring to know that no matter what choices we've made in the past, no matter how far we might feel from God, his love is always there reaching out to us, inviting us into a deeper, more meaningful relationship with him. But I think we need to take a break here and give our listeners some time to process all of this.
That's a good idea. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of covenantal love and its implications for our lives. So as we continue exploring this concept of covenantal love, I think it's important to consider the practical implications of what we've been discussing.
Okay.
It's one thing to acknowledge God's love in theory, but how does that love actually play out in our lives? What does it look like to live in a way that reflects that love?
That's a great question, and I think the lesson provides some really insightful answers through the parable of the unforgiving servant in Matthew 18. This is a story that many of us are familiar with, but I always find new layers of meaning each time I revisit it.
It's a parable that really gets to the heart of what it means to receive and extend God's grace and forgiveness.
Yeah, let's break it down for our listeners who might not be as familiar with this parable.
Okay.
The story begins with a servant who owes his master an astronomical debt, 10,000 talents. To put that into perspective, the lesson points out that this would be the equivalent of 200,000 years of labor for the average worker back then.
Wow.
It's basically an impossible sum to repay, highlighting the overwhelming weight of our sin and our inability to ever bridge that gap on our own.
Exactly. It represents the complete bankruptcy of humanity when it comes to earning God's favor.
Right.
We are utterly dependent on his grace.
Yeah, and yet in this parable, the master moves by compassion, completely forgives this insurmountable debt.
It's amazing.
It's a pure act of mercy, freely given, undeserved, a beautiful picture of the kind of radical forgiveness that God offers us through Christ.
A beautiful picture.
But then the story takes this interesting turn. This same servant who has just been forgiven this unimaginable debt goes out and encounters a fellow servant who owes him a relatively small amount, 100 denarii. And instead of extending the same mercy and compassion that he himself just received, he demands payment and throws his fellow servant into prison when he can't pay. Talk about a lack of perspective.
The contrast is striking. The servant, having experienced the overwhelming generosity of his master, completely fails to grasp the significance of what he's been given. He holds on to this petty debt as if it somehow outweighs the monumental sum that he himself was forgiven.
And as the parable unfolds, the master finds out about the unforgiving servant's actions and is understandably outraged. He revokes his initial forgiveness and hands the servant over to be punished. It's a sobering reminder that while God's love is freely given, our response to that love, our willingness to extend that same grace to others, has real consequences.
The lesson makes a crucial point here. It's not that God's love changes or that he stops loving us if we fail to forgive others. But when we cling to bitterness and resentment, when we refuse to let go of the wrongs that others have done to us, we create a barrier in our own hearts that prevents us from experiencing the fullness of God's love and forgiveness.
It's like we're building a wall around our own hearts and then wondering why God's love can't seem to get through.
Right.
It's a powerful image of how our own unforgiveness can actually hinder our relationship with God.
The key takeaway here is that forgiveness isn't just something we do for other people, it's something we do for ourselves. When we choose to forgive, we're not saying that what the other person did was okay or that they shouldn't be held accountable for their actions.
Right.
But we're choosing to release the anger and bitterness that are poisoning our own hearts. We're choosing to break free from the chains of resentment that keep us bound in the past.
And that freedom, that release, opens us up to experience the fullness of God's love and grace in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Yeah.
But forgiveness isn't easy, especially when we've been deeply hurt or betrayed. It's not just a matter of saying the words, "I forgive you." It's a process, often a painful one, that requires humility, courage, and a willingness to let go of our need for revenge or retribution.
I think that's why the lesson includes the story of Corrie ten Boom. It's a powerful example of how choosing to forgive, even when it feels impossible, can lead to profound healing and transformation.
You have to remind me about that story. I know I've heard of Corrie ten Boom, but I don't recall the details.
Corrie ten Boom was a Dutch Christian who, along with her family, risked their lives to hide Jews during World War II.
Wow.
They were eventually betrayed and sent to a concentration camp where Corrie's sister tragically died after the war. Corrie dedicated her life to sharing the message of God's love and forgiveness, and in one particularly poignant incident, she found herself face to face with a former Nazi guard who had been responsible for much of the suffering she and her family endured in the camp.
Wow, that must have been an incredibly difficult and emotional encounter. What happened when she saw this man?
Corrie later wrote about how she initially struggled with feelings of anger, bitterness, and a desire for revenge. She wanted to lash out at him, to condemn him, to withhold forgiveness. But as she prayed, she felt God's love washing over her, reminding her of the immense forgiveness she herself had received through Christ. And in that moment, she found the strength to offer forgiveness to this man who had caused her so much pain.
That is an incredible story of grace and forgiveness in action. It's hard to imagine finding that kind of compassion and strength in the face of such profound suffering. But it speaks to the transformative power of God's love. It's a love that has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, to break the chains of bitterness, and to set us free to love and forgive even our enemies.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract theological concept. This is the kind of love that God calls us to live out in our daily lives. He calls us to be agents of reconciliation, instruments of his peace bearers, of his forgiveness in a world that is desperately in need of it.
That brings us to the final piece of this lesson, which focuses on the importance of reflecting God's love in our interactions with others. It's not enough to simply talk about God's love or to sing about it in church. We're called to embody that love, to make it visible in the way we treat others, even those who are difficult to love.
The Apostle John captures this beautifully in his first letter, where he writes, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. If God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been perfected in us."
That's a powerful passage. It's like this
Mhm.
beautiful equation. God's love for us plus our love for God equals love for others. And it's not just a matter of being nice or polite. It's about allowing God's love to flow through us, to use us as conduits of his grace and mercy, to see every interaction as an opportunity to reflect his love to the world.
I love the way the lesson uses the analogy of doing something kind for someone's child as a way of expressing love for the parent. It reframes our perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It reminds us that every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every gesture of forgiveness is a way of loving God because it's a reflection of his love for humanity.
It's so much more than just doing good deeds. It's about aligning our hearts with God's heart, allowing his love to transform our thinking, our motivations, our actions, and ultimately our relationships with others.
Right.
And that's where the rubber really meets the road, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It's easy to talk about love in abstract terms,
Mm-hmm.
but the real test is how we embody that love in our daily lives, in our interactions with our families, our friends, our coworkers, even strangers we encounter on the street.
You're absolutely right. It's about those seemingly small choices we make each day to choose kindness over judgment, patience over frustration, forgiveness over resentment. It's in those moments that we truly reflect the transformative power of covenantal love.
This is such a rich and challenging topic, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface as we wrap up this part of our deep dive. I'm curious to hear what's been resonating with you most about this exploration of God's covenantal love.
Well, for me, it's the realization that God's love isn't just this abstract force out there somewhere. It's
Right.
a personal, relational reality that we can experience, that we can participate in, that we can allow to shape our lives in profound ways.
Yeah, and it's incredibly reassuring to know that no matter what choices we've made in the past, no matter how far we might feel from God, his love is always there reaching out to us, inviting us into a deeper, more meaningful relationship with him. And I think the story of King Manasseh really highlights that beautifully. I mean,
Yeah.
here's a man who committed some of the most horrific acts imaginable, and yet when he finally humbled himself and turned back to God, he was met with open arms, complete forgiveness and restoration.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that no matter what choices we've made in the past, no matter how far we've strayed from God's path,
Right.
it's never too late to turn back and experience the fullness of his love and forgiveness.
It's incredibly liberating to know that no matter what we've done, no matter how far we've fallen short, we can always choose a different path, a path that leads us back into alignment with God's love and purpose for our lives.
And that choice to turn back to God, to embrace his love and forgiveness, is ultimately a choice to love ourselves.
Mm.
Because it's in aligning ourselves with his love, with his truth, with his will for our lives, that we find our true identity, our purpose, and our deepest fulfillment.
It's like we're finally coming home after a long journey, a journey that may have taken us far from where we were meant to be. And when we step back into the embrace of God's love, we realize that we were never truly lost. He was always there waiting for us, longing for us to return to him.
And this journey back to God, this process of transformation and restoration, isn't a solo mission. We have the Holy Spirit to guide us, to comfort us, to empower us to live in a way that reflects God's love. It's a journey that requires courage, humility, and a willingness to surrender our own will to his. But it's a journey that leads to life, to joy, to peace, and to a love that knows no bounds.
As we wrap up this deep dive into covenantal love, I'm left with a sense of awe at the sheer magnitude of God's love for us. It's a love that is both profound and personal, a love that meets us where we are and yet calls us to become more than we ever thought possible. And I believe the key to unlocking the fullness of that love lies in our willingness to receive it, to embrace it, and to reflect it in our interactions with others.
You've said it beautifully. It's not enough to simply acknowledge God's love intellectually or to talk about it in theoretical terms. True covenantal love is a lived experience, a love that is expressed, shared, and multiplied through our actions, our words, and our relationships.
So I want to leave our listeners with a challenge and invitation to put this covenantal love into practice in their own lives. Who in your life needs to experience the kind of love and forgiveness that God has shown you? It might be a family member, a friend, a coworker, or even someone you find difficult to love.
Don't just think about it. Act on it. What small act of kindness, what word of encouragement, what gesture of forgiveness can you offer today? Remember, love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. And it's in those daily choices, those seemingly insignificant moments, that we truly reflect the transformative power of God's covenantal love.
Let that love be your guide, your motivation, and your compass as you navigate the complexities of life. And as always, don't forget to subscribe and share this channel with anyone you think might enjoy it. Let's spread this message of love and grace far and wide.